Good evening from Rocky Mountain PBS. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Welcome to Colorado State of Mind. Tonight, a conversation on the evolution of public discourse, civility. It's a topic we return to from time to time on this program, and the deadly shooting spree in Tucson touched off many more conversations around the country. Our guests this evening are three people who have been and are in various positions of local and state leadership, and here they are. First from Denver.
I'm Andrew Romanoff. I used to be the Speaker of the House of Representatives in Colorado. I work now for an international development organization in Lakewood called IDE. We equip small-scale farmers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America with the technology and training they need to climb out of extreme poverty.
Very interesting. And joining us from Grand Junction.
Hi, I'm Teresa Coons. I'm currently the mayor of the city of Grand Junction. I've served on the Grand Junction City Council for 6 years. I'm now in my second term. I'm also a medical researcher by training, and so I've engaged in debates both in a political and in a scientific arena. So
Very
glad
good
to be here.
We're glad to have you. And from Broomfield.
Hello, I'm Sean Mitchell, State Senator representing Broomfield, Adams, and Weld counties. I'm Vice Chairman of the Mitchell family, known for enjoying a good debate and sometimes having my civility called into question by my teenage children.
They will do that. Thanks for being here. And Kelly Brough from the Denver Chamber was also to be with us here, but was sick, unfortunately, and we are going to go ahead with our three guests. I want to say that we didn't invite them here to discuss only politics and government, although civility there is almost certainly more productive. We also want to recognize and discuss the role of the media in this churn, as well as we the people ourselves, as we participate in all kinds of social media. So we know that in that initial wave of shock and partial information, a lot of people on Saturday, January 8th, started speculating about the motivation of the Tucson killer. And it wasn't a big leap to guess that it had something to do with politics, with the attack on a congresswoman. And then people began attacking the most prevalent rhetoric that we're familiar with from both extreme ends of this political spectrum. It was some time later that we began to hear more information indicating that Jared Loughner's motive wasn't a bit clear. But when the president went to the Tucson Memorial last week, he said the civility conversation was one worth having despite the tragic catalyst. You've heard that Colorado Senator Mark Udall is urging mixed seating at the State of the Union event. And so here we have some other public servants, and I'm just wondering, when you think about this polarized rhetoric that I'm referring to, is that a big obstacle to getting everything done?
I might have a different take on it, Cynthia. Let's agree that good manners are always better than bad manners. But I think it probably misstates history to suggest that we're uniquely nasty today and that there was a golden age where everyone was nice to everyone. In fact, our politics used to be more colorful, nastier, and even more violent. There were duels, there were canings in the House chamber. Even in the 60s, hey, LBJ, how many children did you kill today?
Yes, the Vietnam War.
The Vietnam War. Strong feelings are not new in politics, and that's because politics address important subjects, our lives, our freedoms, our resources, our time and opportunities. There is strong feeling and vigorous debate today, but I think there should be about some of the important issues that we're at turning points in our country.
And Sean, I agree with you as far as our history goes, and I think I'd like to follow on your point that that these are important issues and we need to have good discussion and debate. I guess my biggest concern when we retreat into calling names, slurs, labels on people or on ideas is that some of us then fail to hear the discussion and debate, and we focus on the easy labels and really don't spend the time listening to each other. And that's my biggest concern about a lack of civility, is it closes our ears sometimes.
Yeah, I know Andrew needs to jump into the conversation, but let me just say, I certainly agree with you. No one is defending slurs or name calling. I'm talking about passionate substance and vigorous representation of your beliefs.
I think that's where the debate has gotten off track. I agree with both of you. I think vigorous debate, healthy exchange of ideas is what this system of government is all about. Where I think public officials, frankly, and candidates and voters to some extent have done a disservice is to attack the motives and label as traitorous individuals with whom they disagree. And I'll give you an example. I differed sharply with President Bush, George W. Bush, on many, if not most, of his policies, but I never believed that he actually wanted America to fail, or that he woke up in the morning trying to set the country on a path towards destruction. I don't believe that now. I believe the far left was wrong, for example, to call General Petraeus, and I think the far right is wrong to suggest somehow that Barack Obama is a traitor to America or wishes the country ill.
And that is the extreme we're talking about. If you listen to Colorado Public Radio, you may have heard a piece this week about Darrell Issa, the congressman who's taking over a committee that gives him the power essentially to get anyone in there for an investigation, so it can be used very politically. Apparently he has set the ground rules that it's going to be nothing before President Obama took office. So there will be, you know, none of this investigation into the where was he born and all of these things that have lingered. So that seems like a good sign, doesn't it?
Well, sure, we should focus on current issues and the actual policy choices that are in front of us today. But some of those policy differences are fundamental. There are people that are trying to make our system more like a European social welfare democracy. Don't name call, don't insult anyone's motives, but you can vigorously argue that America has a different tradition, a different set of guiding values and aspirations, and there is a fundamental problem with trying to make us a more socialist nation. If I use that word, then people immediately bristle and get angry, but I think that's what's at stake. Freedom, free enterprise, individual autonomy versus a more controlled and planned economy.
All of you have been in situations. I'm sorry, Teresa, go ahead and make your comment.
Oh, I was just going to say, I would like to say that I think maybe to avoid the discussion about our own personal fundamental beliefs, but get back to the idea of how we discuss these beliefs. And one of my concerns, again, is that, and this may be getting to your question, Cynthia, about the role of the media, we've become so focused on 30-second sound bites, or now maybe 20-second sound bites, short clips. We don't focus on an in-depth discussion of issues, and that system lends itself to an uncivil discourse, I think, because having the civil discourse really requires us to stop and listen and think and go in depth with issues.
All right, there's so many directions we can go with this, but I want to go back to Senator Mitchell. I know that you use Facebook to discuss various things. You have discussed civility. Do you find that in that world, people are as wrought up as they seem to be portrayed?
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned Facebook, which is probably an excessive indulgence of mine. I think it's representative of modern media and the internet and more remote interaction, where it is easy to lose sight of mutual humanity, and there's just a name on the page, and we hurl insults back and forth sometimes, and I sometimes have to put the brakes on discussions and ask people not to be so pointed and so personal. So back to Teresa's point, name calling is not defensible. Personal nastiness back and forth are not reasonable or constructive in the discussion.
I think the internet is a tremendous tool for disseminating information, but also misinformation or outright disinformation. You know, Mark Twain, writing 100 years before the invention of this technology, said, "A lie can make its way halfway around the world while the truth is still tying its shoes." Or maybe he said, well, the truth is still putting on its pants, but that wouldn't have been as civil. And I think that's the challenge now, is how to sort fact from fiction.
It is, and you kind of wonder, you know, who is bothering to do much of that, because it is very convenient, if you'd like, to only consume media that backs up what you think already.
I think that's another temptation of the age. There is so much more information available, and it's so specialized to different websites. Unlike the old days when there were 3 big networks and a few radio stations, the left can pick their favorite websites for ammunition, the right picks their favorite websites for ammunition. We all talk to like-minded people and then shoot at each other across a great divide, and
and most people dwell in the divide.
Yeah. On the other hand, again, we're dealing with such important and fundamental issues. People used to resolve these differences with wars and with bullets and with violence, and the fact that we have a republic that for over 200 years has been generally peaceful and peaceful transition of power after every election. We're doing something right, and sometimes I think we're too concerned just because feelings are strong or argument is vigorous that it's somehow not healthy. No, these are important human questions, and argument will be vigorous.
So in historical perspective, do you two agree that it will be seen as another phase of many that we've been through?
You know, I didn't serve for 200 years. It just feels that way. But I have heard from a number of retiring senators who've suggested that that chamber in particular used to be a place in which compromise was more possible and moderation was more in demand. You know, I've heard that from folks like Alan Simpson, and even Gary Hart suggested that statesmanship that characterized some of his colleagues in the past is now passed out of the U.S. Capitol.
Just a reminder that at least in this country, we did have a period of time in the late 60s and early 70s when cities were burning and people were discussing or displaying their concerns in a very violent way. So it could happen, and it has happened in this country. But aside from the issue of name calling or angry discussions, the idea that we tend to polarize ourselves and not really spend any time talking to people who disagree with us, or trying to spend more time understanding the other side's issues is a concern to me, because I think as the media gets more dispersed, we can choose what we listen to, what we read. I think we're becoming more polarized. That doesn't mean necessarily violently, but it certainly makes it more difficult to create solutions.
What about your personal safety? The two of you who have served in the legislature, did you, we know there is security there, did you ever feel that you needed to be more separated from people you didn't know?
I really don't. And in fact, I think the metal detector at the entrances to the Capitol is, I kind of wish it would go away and go back to the open public entrances we used to have. If I can go back to kind of the fundamental point you are making, though, about the tense climate, perhaps the shooting in Arizona having something to do with our political rhetoric, I think that argument has been abandoned by most observers. They realized that the individual was mentally ill and that politics and talk radio and those things just played no part. And if anything, his views skew more liberal than conservative. But what's interesting is that the media all immediately jumped on and started criticizing conservatives for conservative rhetoric, when in fact there is just as much harshness and aggression and shrill debate coming from the left. But it seems like whenever the media is stroking its chin and tut-tutting about civility, it's really almost always about vocal conservatives. If conservatives are scoring points or winning debates or winning elections, then the media is saying, we're getting too uncivil.
You know, there's one other missing part of the debate that follows this tragedy, and as we mourn the victims and offer our condolences to those who are grieving and pray for the health of those who are still recovering, we ought to be having a conversation in this country, in my view, about mental illness and a massive effort to treat folks who are suffering from mental illness. That's not happening to my knowledge right now.
And that's a good segue, because we have begun to hear more about this, and the question was, I think for everyone had some sense. This college told him not to come back until he had a note that he was okay to be there. But who was in charge of enforcing, making sure he did what he was supposed to do? Because he was 22, right?
I know there have been some discussions by law enforcement officials who suggested that we relax the standards by which they're able to apprehend folks or confine folks who pose a threat to themselves or to others. But this would be, if there is any good to come out of this horrible event, I think a useful national conversation.
I think I want to agree with Andrew. The most important lessons we can learn from this are about the holes in our mental health system and the social safety net. In fact, there were lots of indications that this guy was dangerous and threats he had made, but law enforcement either chose not to act or felt powerless to act. And we need to take a look at public safety and how we're protecting the most vulnerable and not well members of society from themselves and us from them.
Teresa, what do you think about that?
Well, I would agree that we need to take a serious look at how we deal with mental illness in this country. I have spent a lot of time in the healthcare arena I sit on the Mesa County Board of Health, and we spend a lot of time talking about physical health and how we deal with that. Very often the issue of mental health or paying for treatment for people with mental illnesses gets shoved to the side as if it's not part of that health conversation. So I agree. We need to put that back into our conversation.
And another telling part of this whole episode is some of these weaknesses in the mental health system have long been known and commented on and worried about, but that isn't where the first media commentators hit. Within hours of, people are still being seen in the emergency room, and first responders are on the scene in Arizona, and Paul Krugman of the New York Times is blogging that this was almost certainly political and it's Sarah Palin's fault. And he just sparked an ugly national wave of essentially libel and slander. And what was very interesting about that was it was political advocates calling for civility by accusing their political opponents of being accomplices to murder.
It's possible that both things are true here, that this act was the work of a deranged man, irrespective of political motivations or the chatter that surrounds the country. And it's also equally possible that it's not helpful for political candidates to put crosshairs or targets or to talk about reloading when taking out political opponents. It's possible actually to have to reach both conclusions separate and equally.
And I think it's in our political conversations, we clearly see that division between, as you said, Sean, conservative and liberal. But if we look at our election process, we also see it among inter-party discussions of candidates, people pointing fingers at each other and slandering.
There are sometimes hard-fought primaries. We know that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it isn't always just a conservative-liberal discussion.
Cynthia, can I grab something that Andrew mentioned when he talked about the sort of the military metaphors, crosshairs, and I think there's a risk of overreaction to the point of silliness here. We have, and I'm not accusing Andrew of this personally, but the other night on CNN, a commentator talked about it was either a targeted district or someone was in the crosshairs, and then he caught himself and apologized and said, we don't want to use those words anymore. This is just such an over-psychological reaction. For decades, we have talked about campaigns and targeted districts, and there have been gun sites on different political districts, both on the right and on the left. This kind of military metaphor just isn't going to push a crazy person to go kill. There are tragedies that may happen, but it's not because sports or military provides metaphors for political conversation. And we shouldn't pretend that it does, because we're at risk of sort of the equivalent of suspending first graders for having a paring knife in their lunchbox after a school shooting. We're importing that same kind of overprotective mentality into our political discourse. We can be adults.
You know, if Kelly Brough were here, I would be asking her about this pledge that the Denver Chamber of Commerce put together. It actually started with the group of people who were campaigning against those 3 fiscal amendments that were on the ballot in the fall. And apparently, in working together, these labor groups and nonprofits and businesses and, total coalition decided that the thing to do was everybody sign on to continue working together as best they can. And if you go to the Denver Chamber website, you can see who has signed on to this pledge. What do you think of that in the legislature? Will it make a difference?
I hope so. When I was the Speaker of the House, I tried hard to, and I'm sure that Speaker McNulty will follow, to enforce a rule that says you can criticize a bill, but you can't attack the motives of the sponsor. And it may seem like a quaint, old-fashioned notion that this sort of decorum would be a matter of House or hopefully Senate protocol, but I think it's helpful. There's one other point I want to make, and kids pick up on these cues too. I remember leading children in tours of the Capitol and taking them to the House floor, and they would notice everybody yelling at each other, or worse yet, not listening to one another at all, as Terry was saying earlier. And the kids would say, well, our folks tell us we're supposed to listen. Why isn't nobody here actually listening to one another? It's a tough answer.
Your comments about the effort in the legislature to get people to work well together. The Grand Junction City Council at one point decided that one of our rules was going to be that we would assume positive intent. And the purpose of that was to get people to take the personal out of it and listen to the argument and assume that we were all there for the same purpose, the good of our citizens in Grand Junction, and look at the issue, not the person.
I think that is always a good reminder, and I think that's one of the positive things that can come out of the chamber effort. I'll be maybe a little more personal and conciliatory here. I've crossed the line a time or two. I've been both uncivil and forceful in debate, and I know the difference. And if you jab someone, if you insult someone, that's uncivil. But I also think that when you are arguing forcefully, sometimes they don't like it just because your arguments are effective. Sometimes it feels like civility is wielded as a shield. Stop arguing against my position. You're being uncivil.
Stop being right.
Yeah.
And some of the ideological name calling, I think, is a substitute for the kind of effective argument that Sean's talking about. I remember in a committee once I was promoting a proposal to help more kids get coverage through the Children's Health Plan, and one of the legislators in opposition to that proposal accused me of promoting socialism. So I gave her a long speech about the Romanov family's opposition to socialism and communism back in Mother Russia, but I went over the head there.
Do you think, it seems to me that we frequently in Colorado are either, well, we're obviously always comparing ourselves to other people. This week in the legislature, a bill very much like Arizona's in terms of immigration enforcement came along, and so Arizona was, mentioned in that discussion. Do you feel as though Colorado is quite a bit different than other states or the country as a whole? There
are similarities and differences, obviously, and I think that bill and your reference to it in the context of civility is a good example. I think it's possible to debate what our border policy should be and whether or not government officials should get proper identification of individuals without assuming incivility or bad motives on the part of the sponsors and supporters of that bill. I can't resist going back to make one uncivil observation, though. And Andrew talks about the Romanov family's long resistance to communism, and perhaps originally they were, but they've since fallen prey to Stockholm Syndrome.
Nice.
Oh.
Mr. Speaker.
Oh, well. All right, I'm going to wrap.
I'll civilly let that go. Here.
Just going to let that go. All right, though, I insist everybody come up with a last thought. We're running out of time, and I would just like to hear what you think is going to happen in the days going forward, weeks going forward. Does it really matter? Will this change anything? Teresa, do you want to start?
I don't know that it'll change things, but I hope that it raises some awareness about how we have discussions and debates and gets people to start thinking about the issues and not worrying so much about the person.
Senator Mitchell.
It'll change a little. Reminders help. Sometimes when you want to shake your fist, maybe you'll remember not to. It won't bend the course sharply, but it might raise the tone a little.
And Speaker Romanoff, Speaker Romanoff.
As I said, my hope, without excusing the gunman or politicizing the crime, I hope is that this tragedy prompts a real national commitment, a bipartisan commitment to mental health.
I hope, well, two things. I agree with Andrew that the most valuable thing that can come out of the Arizona episode is an examination of our mental health system. But I hope the media does some reflection on the role it played piling on. In fact, Americans' reaction generally was fair and even-handed and wait till the facts are in. But the media immediately started dogpiling on conservatives and blaming Tea Party members and others. And it was a false direction. It just shouldn't have been part of the discussion.
Do you two agree? I mean, I would have said that everybody started jumping. I mean, from both sides of the media, that people were suddenly in an argument about it.
Well, my feeling was, for example, Sarah Palin released a statement defending herself, and now she's being blamed for joining the brawl. Well, once you're accused of being an accomplice to murder, you have to defend yourself.
Andrew?
My suspicion is that there is a temptation to try to draw some larger meaning from this tragedy. It's tough to dismiss this as such a senseless act. People want to find a pattern, and it's possible that this conversation, untethered from the events in Tucson, will produce some good results like those we've discussed.
Let me join that last thought by Andrew. Sometimes big things happen by serendipity and human frailty. There may not be political lessons. In a wild and free world, ugly things can still happen.
I thank you all for doing this evening. It was a great discussion. That's Colorado State of Mind this week. You can see this program again or check out what's happening on the discussion board at our website. Thank you to Andrew Romanoff and to Teresa Coons and to Senator Sean Mitchell. Next week, Colorado State of Mind has a new cousin, so to speak. We'll begin an occasional series called Colorado Quarterly. Rocky Mountain PBS CEO Doug Price and an RMPBS board member, Tim Foster of Mesa State College, will be here with Dottie Lamb and Lynn Gangone at the Women's College at DU. The provocative topic for them is whether U.S. education is inadvertently causing boys to fail. Hope you'll tune in for that next Friday at 7:30. We'll be back the following week. I'm Cynthia Hessen. Good night.
I co-wrote an op-ed with some folks in an Aspen Institute fellowship called the Rodell Fellowship in Public Leadership, because Gabby Giffords was a member of that fellowship. So I've known her for about a dozen years. And one of the things that she said, and we wrote, is that the sort of advent of the automatic garage door opener and the decline and fall of the front porch in America has sort of left neighbors isolated and cocooned.